Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to More Conversations. With us is Ambassador William J. vanden Heuvel. Bill vanden Heuvel has truly seen it all, steeping himself in the tumultuous issues that have absorbed our times. Historian Douglas Brinkley calls him a brave and open-hearted American patriot. The child of immigrants, he has been for decades, an advocate for the underdog, working to stamp out racial and religious bigotry, accomplish prison reform, solve refugee problems, and mitigate the scourge of world poverty. He has been in the trenches with his mentor, Wild Bill Donovan, who founded the OSS during World War II, the spy organization that fathered the CIA. He served in the Air Force, ran for Congress, marched with Martin Luther King in Mississippi, advised Bobby Kennedy when he ran for president in 1968, became Jimmy Carter's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva and New York, crusaded for prison reform, and as a capstone to a brilliant career, led the project to complete the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Four Freedoms Park in New York City, all the while shining in the private sector as an investment banker and lawyer. Bill vanden Heuvel has written a dynamite memoir entitled Hope and History, a memoir of tumultuous times in which he recounts the great moments of a spectacularly fruitful life and reminds us that perilous times are before us when we all have a civic duty to care deeply about the direction of American politics. I'm pleased to welcome my friend Bill vanden Heuvel to the program.
Thank you, Jim.
So, Bill, tell us about your beginnings, because you write about them in the book, and they're very interesting.
Well, I grew up in Rochester, New York. My parents were immigrants from Holland and Belgium, had come over separately during the 20s, and it was the Depression, and I was born in the Depression. And that was a special experience by itself. My mother ran a boarding house, and my father was a laborer in a factory in Rochester. But Rochester was an interesting city of opportunity. George Eastman had touched it with his magic wand, and all the great things of philanthropy were available to the poor as well as to the rich.
He founded Eastman Kodak?
He founded Eastman Kodak, which is a lesson to everybody, because when I was a kid in Rochester, 45,000 people worked for Eastman Kodak. Today it went bankrupt. So the lessons are very much there. In any event, I was always interested in history and politics and public affairs at a very young age. And Franklin Roosevelt was my hero and our hero and the hero of all those who were working class people. And then, of course, with the war, he was an extra hero because he was defending countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, where my parents had come from. So I was very fortunate to win a special scholarship out to a small school in California called Deep Springs. I had 24 students.
This is a high school?
No, it was college.
The college?
2 years, the first 2 years of college.
Ah.
Founded by an entrepreneur of those wild days who wanted to show that isolation of young men, I was 15 when I went there, isolation of young men, and combined with a work program of intensity and combined with an extraordinary educational program, might produce leaders.
Now, you were 15 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt died.
Yes.
Did you ever meet him?
No.
Ever
I
see
saw him.
Oh, tell us about that.
I saw him. I was on the shoulders of my father in 1936 when Franklin Roosevelt came to Rochester, and they always had these torchlight parades, and even then, he was the hero of myself, much more than anyone else in my family. So that Roosevelt, I met Mrs. Roosevelt during
Oh, you knew her well.
Well, even as a boy, when she came to Rochester for I Am an American Day, I made my mother take me to that, and then I went up afterward to say hello to Mrs. Roosevelt. She was so gracious, always said all of those things, right? So then when I came to know her very well in the context of New York politics and otherwise, I told her the story of how I had come to Hyde Park when the anniversary of the president's death, the first year, and when they gave the Hyde Park to the nation. And that's where I met Harry Truman and all of that. But Roosevelt was the figure. He was an extraordinary president. I felt as though I knew him.
Well, you've called him the greatest president of the 20th century.
Well, more importantly, most historians call him that, and it's very fairly earned.
So before we get to today, tell us about Wild Bill Donovan, another legendary figure with whom you were quite close.
I was a young lawyer. I had graduated from Cornell Law School. I had been editor-in-chief of the Law Review, so I had offers from a number of law reviews.
Wow.
Law firms.
From law review to law firm, that's how it works.
Several of the Donovan partners, and he had formed the firm in 1929 when Herbert Hoover broke a promise to appoint him as Attorney General because of the Baptist bishops who protested that having a Catholic as Attorney General could not be so in America. So I went to his firm on the basis of knowing a couple of the partners. I was 19, 20 years old at that time. And one night, in 1952, as young lawyers were wont to do, I was working in the library. And General Donovan came up. He didn't know my name, but he knew I was in the firm. He said, "Young man, can you help me in this research?" I said, "I'll try to, sir." He said, "Well, I'm debating Estes Kefauver tomorrow on whether or not the Democratic Party has been good for America in the last 20 years."
Kefauver was a Democratic senator from Tennessee.
And the candidate for vice president.
Yes.
Later, in '56. So I said to him, when I think of the temerity of my response, I'm astonished. I said, "General, I'm a Democrat, and my hero is Franklin Delano Roosevelt." I said, perhaps I can best help you by saying what the Democrats will say, and then we can work out the response that you would give to that. So we did that. We worked through late hours and night. And the next day he took me with him to the debate, which he won in smashing colors. And I essentially stayed with him for the rest of his life.
How long were you with him?
6 years.
6 years.
And, you know, in the military world, he was not a professional soldier. He was a citizen soldier. He was the most decorated man in America, militarily. And he won the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War I. He was probably the greatest hero of World War I. And as he was dying, and I was living with him at the time, those who were the veterans of the Fighting 69th, who'd been in those battles in World War I, would come through, and I would make copious notes of what they would tell me about. And when the general died, I wrote a long essay on him. So Donovan was a very, very important, and I went to the Hungarian Revolution with him. He was then chairman of the International Rescue Committee. I succeeded him as president of the International.
Is that how you first got interested in refugees and their plight?
In the Hungarian Revolution.
Yes.
And that was '56.
And of course, we see that very same problem today, displaced persons coming from Syria.
Yeah, and I mean, today the International Rescue Committee is led by David Miliband.
Yes, he's been a guest on this program and very, very competent.
Wonderful man. And the IRC is a major organization in the refugee field. And the handling of the Syrian thing, had it been handled as Miliband and others in the refugee world would have advised, would have saved, I think, Western Europe, frankly, because they made the connection between what was happening in the war in Syria and what was happening to the refugee flow into Europe that was undermining the governments of Western Europe.
Okay, so from refugees to desegregation, you also were a major player in the effort to desegregate.
Well, after the general
schools.
died, I went to, it was the beginning of the Kennedy era, and I was appointed Assistant Attorney General to Robert Kennedy.
How did you get to know Robert Kennedy?
I knew his sister, Jean Smith, well, and in the 1960 campaign, I ran for Congress against John Lindsay, but Bobby, of course, was the campaign manager. And so Arthur Schlesinger and Ken Galbraith urged him to bring me on board. And so I was his assistant, and then he said, well, go into Virginia and deal with the segregation problem there, especially Prince Edward County.
Well, there they had an ingenious way of dealing with the Brown v. Board of Education, the desegregation problem. They just closed all the schools.
They took the position.
All the schools.
That the Supreme Court can tell us to operate our schools on a desegregated basis, but there's nothing that can tell us they have schools. So they closed all the schools in Prince Edward County as a test case. And for 5 years, the children of Prince Edward County did not have schools. And when Attorney General Kennedy sent me in there, I came back with a recommendation that was extraordinarily different than what he had heard from before. I said, let's set up our own school system. Let's show them how to run a school. And that's what we did. And teachers from around the country came to Prince Edward County. It was in this book. In the book, I tell the story of Prince Edward County. And it was a very relevant story, even to today. But it was regarded as one of the great success stories of the civil rights movement. And it was one of the 5 cases that was part of Brown against Board of Education that went before the Supreme Court. And so we finally, we set up a school system in a matter of weeks.
So these were called free schools.
Free schools.
And they were run under the
I raised the money privately.
Under the supervision of the federal government.
No.
Not at all.
Not at all, except that the Justice Department was very much involved, and Robert Kennedy was very much involved, and the credit for the whole success of the operation belongs to him because he was prepared to take some chances. So we set up a school system, brought in teachers from around the country. It was extraordinary to see teachers who were so anxious to be part of the movement to change the nation in terms of racial injustice. And it was a school that showed them how a school could be run. It brought together the African Americans, and it brought together the white nationalists populated, because this was a very conservative kind. But it worked out well.
So did whites send their children to the free schools?
No, not many.
Not many.
Only 7 families did. But it was terribly important to have that because I could see what white presence in a school like that meant, because the black leadership interpreted the white presence as the guarantee that they wouldn't be abandoned. And that really was the case. I mean, there were wonderful leaders. Reverend Griffin, who was the leader of the local church, brave men, people with their lives threatened, and the children, brave children, to undertake that. And these were very poor people, and it was a very poor part of Virginia. So we won the case 9-0 in the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court held that the government has to have schools.
You had to have not only,
and they have to have integrated schools.
And you couldn't have charter schools like they had, white schools, that were not established by public authority, but by private authority. As a private school, you couldn't do that and take public funds from the public schools and help manage it. It was a very important decision at the time, now well absorbed. But Prince Edward County was, Robert Kennedy and the president regarded it as one of the capstones of the civil rights struggle that they were involved in.
Okay, so you lost to John Lindsay in the 1960 congressional race in the Silk Stocking District, and then in 1966, I guess, Lindsay becomes mayor and was elected in 65, and you kept up with him, didn't you?
Yeah, it was a very interesting situation because we had a hard-fought campaign in 1960, but I stayed in touch with him. And then one day in 1970, after he had been reelected, and the prisons were filled with riots and suicide, it was a time of great disaster, he called me and asked me if I would be chairman of the Board of Correction. Well, it worked out, and he was in my experience, I know he's criticized at many quarters, but I found him to be an excellent leader, a person who knew the subject of the prisons and who supported the new Board of Correction that he appointed. And
what were the conditions of the city's prisons at that time? You had the notorious one was the Tombs, which wasn't even a prison, it was a house of detention.
One statistic will give you some idea. When I took over the Board of Corrections, there were 25,000 prisoners in the city detention system. Today there are 9,000. And that, of course, confronted what is a real problem in prisons everywhere, which is overcrowding. The prisons, the tombs, for example, were cells 6 foot by 8 foot and had at least 2 prisoners in it, and sometimes 3. And there was violence, there's suicides. The first report we gave was a report on a suicide by a young Puerto Rican prisoner who had just been arrested on a narcotics charge. And it was, the New York Times printed the whole report. It was called Death of a Citizen. And there was a remarkable response to that. I had gone to 10 law firms and asked them to give me a young associate for 6 months.
One from each law firm?
One from each law firm. And because we didn't have any money, and there was no budget for the Board of Correction at that point. By 6 months, we were really going. We'd issued these extraordinary reports. The Times had printed them. Newsweek had written. So there was a new sense of possibility in the prisons. And this wonderful opportunity that I had, I've tried to translate into my book, Hope and History, so that people could see what's possible. The prisons are a very difficult environment. I mean, it has no natural constituency. People, politicians stay away from it, and generally when they talk about prisons, they talk about the harshness that they want to have reinforced. We talked in a different language, and the programs in the prisons were terrific. We had literacy programs, public health programs, things that were not costly, but were very effective.
Now, while you were at it with the prisons, we had the Attica riots, didn't we?
We did. I was chairman those days. Attica, of course, was a state prison, but it galvanized the interests of every prison system in the country. And then the ending of the Attica riots was so horrible, 43 people killed, and all of them killed by state authorities, not by prisoners. And Attica opened up, I think.
Well, you had 10 correction officers were killed, but 1 by friendly fire.
They were killed by state troopers.
Yeah.
And that was, when people found that out, that was really a shock.
It was quite a controversy at the time because of the failure of Governor Rockefeller to go to the prison or even to send a deputy, I think his deputy was Bobby Douglas in those days, to visit the prison. Were you critical of him for not going?
The whole thing could have been resolved without the loss of life, without that violence, in my judgment. But Rockefeller was adamant about not visiting, not being part of that discussion. And he was then trying to build up the right side of his political profile. The first person who called him to congratulate him after the thing blowing up with 43 days was Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
So
that didn't quite work for Rockefeller.
And he never backed away from that. He had a very strange end. I mean, the Rockefeller laws, which were draconian.
Drug laws.
Yeah, in the context of narcotics. There are many still on the books, were part of the reason why the prisons were so filled with prisoners.
So was there reform after Attica? What did we learn from Attica?
Well, we're still learning. There was a very good book written recently about Attica. Well, I think what we've learned is that rehabilitation is very difficult in prison. That one of the most important things is to get people out of the prison system as quickly as you can.
So it's been said we have an incarcerated society, but the aspiration...
The United States has over 2 million people incarcerated.
Most of them of color, isn't it?
About half of color.
Yeah.
And more than, the American have more prisoners than the rest of the world put together. So this hasn't changed. It's changing, but it hasn't changed. Attica was, you know, Arthur Lyman was counsel to the Attica Commission. People were startled when they read the Board of Correction reports and then saw it verified in the Attica Commission what was happening in the prisons. So it brought new attention. And I think today, measurably, prisons are better, they're better operated, they're safer, but they're still very difficult places.
Okay, so Richard Nixon, whom you mentioned, resigns from office. Gerald Ford comes in, he runs for election, he's defeated by Jimmy Carter. Now you supported Jimmy Carter. Now how did that come to pass?
I was a Kennedy person, and Ted Kennedy had told me he wasn't going to run. with good reason. And so knowing that, I felt free to pick who I thought not necessarily would win the nomination, but deserved a national hearing. Carter had been on the cover of Time magazine, described as a new liberal governor in the South.
Peanut farmer from Georgia.
He was a peanut farmer, but he was also a graduate of Naval Academy. He was also very close to Admiral Rickover in the nuclear submarine situation. And he was a governor, a very good governor of Georgia. And the first thing he did was to put a portrait of Martin Luther King in the governor's mansion. And people then began to look differently. And in his inaugural address, he said, this is the end of segregation in America. This is the beginning of the end of segregation. So I thought that deserved an audience in America. Scoop Jackson was running, Mo Udall was a candidate, and Carter came to see me and asked if I would be chair of his campaign. And I went down to Atlanta and spent some time with his staff, very impressive, and I agreed to do that in the primary campaign. He survived in New York, but the most important thing was we were able to negotiate an arrangement with Abe Beame, who was mayor, and who then pledged his support to Carter.
Okay, so you were instrumental in Carter's winning election without question, and to the victors belong the spoils. You became an ambassador.
That's right. I didn't ask for anything, and I didn't think I would necessarily get anything because the weight of the whole thing was Southern. But Donovan, Carter, on the night of his presidency, the inaugural, had those who had worked with him closely come to the White House. And so I went to the White House, and as I came down the line and shook hands with him, he said, "Bill, I want you in my administration, and I'll call you." So I didn't do anything, and about 4 months later, he called and invited me to be ambassador to the United Nations in Europe. It was a great assignment. And then I came back to New York after Andrew Young resigned. I became the deputy permanent representative in New York. I was a great believer in the United Nations. I'm not in any irrational, idealistic way. I was a great believer that the United Nations was essential to the governance of the world, if in fact you wanted to accomplish some of the things that we wanted to accomplish.
Well, now we have an administration that is downplaying the United Nations, downplaying all of our alliances.
I mean, as far as this administration is concerned, the UN doesn't exist. And that may be a very good sanctuary, because if you have John Bolton running foreign policy in the United States, the Senate wouldn't even confirm Bolton as ambassador to the UN because of his attitude to the UN. And he was quoted on a number of occasions saying things that were very hostile to the whole concept of the United Nations. And that's one of the things I talk about in Hope and History. If you know the history of the United Nations and America's role in it, and why Roosevelt saw it as such an essential part of international governance, if you know that, then you can develop the hope that someday the time will come when the political forces will be such in the world so that you can reorganize how they look at it. Carter was a very decent, wonderful man in questions like that. He was not a politician by nature. Compromises and things of that kind came to him not easily.
It's quite a surprising statement about someone who attained the highest political office in the nation.
Yes, but it's true. I think people who worked with him understood that. But he was he was at least as smart as anyone else who ever sat in the Oval Office. He was and a delight that he's lived to now. He's 94 years old, and he's still doing extraordinary work, and has easily given the accolade of being the most successful president that we've ever had.
Most successful post-president we've ever had. So we're living now in a time of tremendous turmoil, undeniably, and you have seen it all. Your book is called Hope and History. Do you offer us any hope based on our history? I mean, Churchill said America always gets it right after they've tried everything else.
I think this is an opportunity in its own way. I mean, if the forces that elected Donald Trump remain and are successful in the next election, that's a very dangerous thing. But the things that he has started will take deep root, and I think will be inimical to the world that we knew. I mean, to pull out of treaties, for example, to treat the international effort on climate dangers, to be so careless about the nuclear treaties, and to pull ourselves out of those agreements, and his whole negotiation with North Korea, there's something that is not going to serve America's interests in what this administration has done, in my judgment.
Something rotten in the state of Denmark. So, Bill vanden Heuvel, unfortunately we have to wrap up, but thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous. And what a great life you've spent, and what a great legacy you leave. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.